Yeah, on the gente. Today, I want to take a look at and give my thoughts on the latest Steve Kaufmann on 7 tips for speaking a language better and just kind of give my thoughts. Let's get into it. So, for those of you that don't know, Steve Kaufmann is like a huge figure in like the language learning world. He made LinkQ, which is an awesome resource if you get a chance to go use it, especially if you're trying to study like rare languages. And it's a really good idea. I really love the idea of using source material, bringing in newspapers, bringing in movies and TV shows, and being able to use native source material in order to learn a language. I haven't played with it as much as some of the others, but it's my newest one I've added to the repertoire with helping me learn Arabic. It's given me a ton of new resources I can use, a ton of new things I can read specifically. So it's been really good. But without further ado, let's get into it.
Today, I want to share with you my 7 tips for speaking well in a foreign language. And I would like to speak better because I continue to stumble. I continue not to get the right grammatical form out. And I'm saying, how can I improve? So I thought about this whole issue.
So I feel like this is something that everybody can really relate to is that when we first start speaking, we're always going to make errors. We're going to not get grammar right. We're going to mix up L versus la. We're going to mix up masculine and feminine. We're going to mix up tons of things. We're going to use the wrong ending, right? Just like he's done here with going out and getting a tutor 4 or 5 times a week. That is really the answer to that problem is we just have to continue to practice. We have to continue to force ourselves to use it to a point where it starts to become unconscious and we no longer have to think, okay, what are our endings for present tense, right? We just know them. It just comes out naturally. And that really is a good way to do it by speaking to somebody multiple.
Of how we learn languages and how everyone wants this. So as long as you can be understood and as long as the other person is comfortable, then your pronunciation is good enough.
I 100% agree with this. I think this is a great idea. A lot of people in the beginning, when they're learning Spanish, want to ask, like, oh, is my accent good? Do people understand me? Can you make out what I'm saying? Yes. If I'm quiet, if I'm listening to you, I understand what you're saying, right? Just continue. So I think that this is a really, really apt piece of advice. People are not looking confused by what you're saying. Your accent is good enough. We don't need a perfect accent, like he says, and he's probably going to get into. People who have a perfect accent typically don't, they have a perfect accent for a handful of sentences, but they don't speak very well. They don't understand very well, right? As long as your accent is good enough, I 100% agree. This is a completely accurate.
If you get sort of an expression from the person you're talking to that they don't understand you, then you got to try to improve your pronunciation. And I would focus on intonation in pronunciation. If you're at Link, for example, you can listen to each sentence, hear it spoken, and then try to repeat that sentence with a focus on intonation. Don't put that much importance on pronunciation. It's not the most important thing by any means. I've done business with people in English who have accents but who express themselves well. The pronunciation is not the number one thing when it comes to speaking better.
I think this is very true. People come into learning Spanish, learning any other language, and they're like, oh my God, the accent is going to cause me to not be understood. But have you ever stopped to think about how many accents we have in English? We can go and talk to Australians and Scots and English people and South Africans. And for the most part, we understand each other. Everybody has an accent. Everybody's like, that's kind of a funny word. That might be a funny expression they've chosen, but we understand each other. Same with people who've learned English. Just because they have an Indian accent or a Hispanic accent or a whatever accent, unless it's terrible, we mostly, for the most part, understand. I think this is a really good tip.
Point number 2, focus on words. You won't be surprised that I put words and vocabulary out well ahead of grammar because the language consists of words. That doesn't necessarily mean always remembering them. It means exposing ourselves to them. That's how AI works. There's such a massive exposure to various corpuses of language that the artificial intelligence can predict what's going to happen. And that's the same thing with us. If we have had enough words, we are able to predict what's going to happen in the language. And eventually that enables us to speak better.
So this is 100% accurate. And this is something I say to my students all the time. I don't care if your grammar is perfect. The words are so much more important to our progress in Spanish. When it comes to learning things, when it comes to memorizing things, what we need to focus on is words, because it doesn't matter if you can have perfect grammar. If you only know how to say 4 sentences, it's not super helpful. I would rather you speak like Tarzan, but be able to have a conversation and be able to enjoy yourself rather than worry about like, oh goodness, I, can speak 4 sentences perfectly, but I don't have the words to actually express anything. I saw this all the time where like people had perfect grammar and got great scores on tests, but then were afraid to speak for this reason.
Tip number 3, don't do things that are stressful and that increase your level of stress when using the language. In other words, don't spend too much time on conjugation tables, doing drills, declension tables, trying to memorize rules of grammar, because these will fail you when you go to speak. These are stressful. These force you to start to think of the rule when you're trying to speak. Well, actually, what has to happen is that you have had enough exposure to the language that not only are you predicting how the language is supposed to be, you're actually producing the language correctly.
I disagree somewhat with this point. I think that the study of like grammar charts, verb tables, and conjugations and things like that is a very important thing that you need to do. But I also don't. I also agree with the point of, you know, it does come through exposure to the language, right? The more you see the language, the more oftentimes you see that yo goes with como, right? I goes with am instead of you going with are, right? You're going to pick it up. But if you just rely on exposure to the language, that's never going to work because you're never going to understand the reasons behind why things are happening, right? I think the best way you can practice these verb conjugations is by just practicing the innings, practice it a dozen times until it feels comfortable and you start to get that rhythm of it, and then move into starting to say like short sentences, right? I write a letter, I read a book. Put the conjugations into context, and so they're not just like grammar rules you have in your head.
And if you have a lot of words, you can pull out of your bag a word that works in this situation, and that'll keep the conversation going. So don't spend a lot of time creating stress for yourself by trying to remember the definition of when to use this tense versus that tense. It is not going to help you to speak correctly. It's only going to increase your stress level. Getting used to the language, getting used to the usage patterns is probably, in the long run, going to be more effective than trying to remember rules of grammar. And number 5, fortunately, the usage patterns in any language are limited. It's always, I find when I'm speaking in a foreign language, if I can trot out a pattern that I'm very comfortable using, that I know that works, that really helps me, and I can sort of direct my conversation around these patterns. So the good thing about learning usage patterns is that there's a limited number of them.
Okay, so I kind of see what he's saying here. This is kind of an interesting way he's phrased this, because I've seen this work, this idea he's referring to of like usage patterns. Specifically in like situational awareness, right? Like if you go to the restaurant, typically you're saying the same 4 or 5 things, right? We're talking about the same 4 or 5 hobbies that we do on a day-to-day basis. Our lives are pretty boring. We go to the same places, we hang out with the same people, and we do the same things, right? So if you can get good at talking about those, like the things you like to do, getting really good at quickly learning the key words, like I want, I need, the words that are going to be high use. This is the reason why, for example, I can learn a language pretty quickly because I picked up on these usage patterns a little bit. And I've been able to take them and boil them down into a pretty easy way to learn, regardless what the language is, regardless of how hard it is. That beginner level of like, I just need to get some exposure to the basic words, learn these basic phrases in order to be able to use them. I can start to have conversations really quickly in the language because of that, because we're talking about the same thing.
Now, number 6, always circle back. Don't think you're going to learn anything on the first pass. I have often said that I use.
So I really like this. This is a really important point to have. And this is what I say specifically about learning vocabulary words. You're going to learn new words on the first go. You're going to have to see them multiple times. This is the reason why I tell my students, whenever you come across a new word, write it down, put it in a list where you have all the other new words that you've seen. And then when you wake up in the morning, or as you're in the restroom or cooking dinner or whatever 5 minutes you have, you can pull this list out and review it, because you learn vocabulary not through just sitting there and rote memorization, but the amount of times you see it. So I like this idea of circling back, seeing the same things over and over again, right? Asking questions, reviewing. When you're learning a new verb tense, go back and practice it multiple times, multiple sessions in a row, so that you start to get the hang of it. It'll start to feel more natural versus just trying to memorize the like grammar rules, right? And then use it.
Particularly once I have enough experience with the language that these grammar explanations start to make sense to me. So remember, you're going to have to circle back.
I really think that is key. The study of grammar shouldn't focus on that right out the gate, because it's not going to make any sense, right? That really comes into play once you've already got a basis in the language. You have a few phrases memorized. You got a few like sample conversations you kind of scripted out. You can kind of talk about like, where you're from, what do you do, right? This is why in the beginning, I always focus on like dominating situations, right? Being able to go to the restaurant, being able to go to the market, being able to go shopping, deal with the airport, the hotel. Because once we have those phrases that we've just kind of memorized, we have these situations we feel comfortable with. Then when we go back and study the grammar, it makes way more sense. There's a way bigger base to draw upon versus just you're like, if you start out from the very beginning studying grammar and you have, buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches, and that's all you know, the grammar is not going to make sense. Versus if I just give you some phrases, I'm like, this is what we would say in English. Here's the equivalent in Spanish. We have something to draw upon when we go back and study the grammar later on.
And so finally, point number 7 is we want to speak better. However, in order to speak better, we have to make mistakes. There is no avoiding it. You have to speak a lot in order to speak well. And speaking a lot means that you cannot wait until you are perfect before you start speaking. That means you're going to start speaking a lot with.
I really think that this tip is very apt. I ran into all the time people who in school would be able to, right? Perfect. They would get hundreds on tests, papers, yada, yada, right? But when it came to speaking the language and actually using it in class, if they got called upon in class, whatever, they couldn't use it. They wouldn't go to a market and buy things and order things in Spanish. They couldn't go to a restaurant and order anything, right? We have to make mistakes. And this is the reason they weren't speaking. They were so uncomfortable with the idea of making mistakes that they would rather just not speak at all, not use the language in a real life way, right? But be able to get hundreds and whatever on the tests and the papers. To me, this is entirely useless. I learn languages so I can travel and meet people, right? And I don't want to carry around a whiteboard all day to be able to speak and communicate with people. So you need to get comfortable with the fact that you have to speak. You're going to make mistakes. Most of your mistakes are going to be okay. Like people are going to be able to make out and understand more or less what you're going for. And it doesn't matter if you make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. The fact that you're trying is going to get you props from anybody. Let me know what you guys think. Go check out Steve's original video. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.